I've never been here before. I have no idea whether you have or not. Have you been here before?
No, it's so incredible just to know what happened in here. Like, you know, apart from the Abbey Road album, the Pink Floyd, and everyone else, it's quite humbling to think about the great creativity that's been here.
All I know is it is the one zebra crossing in London where you can be absolutely certain that the drivers will try not to stop. So never cross at this particular crossing. Ian and I think we should kind of state our prejudices before we even begin, are some of the last migration liberals left alive, and so on. So this is just a kind of statement of interest before we go, which meant that I read Ian's book while nodding along. You could argue that we would have done better to have somebody who was kind of more hostile, and so on. So there will be some time for questions, and I'm not arguing for hostility, but if you decide that I haven't actually pressed hard enough, then that will be the moment to do it. So anyway, here's the book, The Shortest History of Migration. I thought I knew quite a lot about migration, but there's a lot of useful stuff in this, actually. And if you're interested in getting into discussions with people about it, it's a really, really handy place to start. So I recommend it. But the first question I want to ask you, Ian, given that you start so early, I mean, essentially we start with the Neanderthals and beyond, so that's how early we go. I read in an American blog by a very clever, slightly conservative American writer that when somebody like J.D. Vance is saying what he's responding to, and I quote, is a literally unprecedented level of migration. Is there currently a literally unprecedented level of migration if we go back to beyond the Stone Age?
No, is the short answer. Of course, like always with statistics, it depends how you define it. As a share of the world's population, so how many people migrate as a share of the population, it's very much at sort of the average we know for about the last 150 years, which is about 3%. Of course, the world's population has grown a lot, and so 3% of a big number is a bigger number than it was when there was only a few million people on Earth. We also don't know what happened before about 1914, because there were no passports. There was no border controls, and of course there were far fewer countries. So we have something like 150 new countries over the last period since the First World War. And if you define migration, as most people I think do in their head, as moving across a national border, people that would have moved within a country now are moving between countries. And so you have much, much more movement across countries, although people are going the same sort of distance. So we actually should expect this share to be going up each time a country is created. And the remarkable thing is that how stable it's been, which is about 3% of the world's population, 97% of people stay put. There were periods in history with much bigger migration numbers. You know, Ireland today, for example, has about 5 million people. If you include Northern Ireland, it's about 6.3 million people or something. The population of Ireland was 8 million in 1850. Well over half the Irish population has moved. And most Irish, of course, are outside Ireland now. The diaspora is something like 30 million people. Mass migration from the partitions, 17 million or so people moved between India and Pakistan and what's now Bangladesh in an absolutely abhorrent process in which over 2 million people died. Partitions in Gaza and Israel, which we're living the legacy of today from the same period, 1947. The split up of the Soviet Union, mass movements of people, again, maybe 20 million people moving from country to country. So no, the numbers are not big relatively, and in many, many cases, and certainly for the UK, they're not even big historically. In other words, there have been periods in the UK's history where more people have come into the country per year, absolutely, than there are now, not least in the 1850s and 60s from Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, I found myself in an argument with people like David Goodhart, and I've said, look, the Irish migration into England is actually significantly greater, given the population at the time, than any migration we have encountered since. To which the answer was, well, Ireland was then part of the United Kingdom. And I said, well, if your problem is actually there's a large number of incoming people to a place and that's what you're worried about, you should include that. But you don't. And you don't do it because it's, I'm going for a hobby horse, aren't I?
Yeah.
Anyway,
no, but I could also, I mean, I've also had some of maddeningly frustrating arguments with David. So I empathise with you.
Can we talk a bit then? I want to go back again to the kind of the early stages about what is natural about movement from the earliest days, and if you like, if we could ever have imagined what the world would have been like if people hadn't moved.
Yeah. Well, let's just start in the present. You and I definitely wouldn't be here, and no one in this room would be. And we wouldn't have had any of the civilizational leaps and bounds that we've had, not only if we hadn't come out of Africa and evolved, but also if ideas hadn't been swapped. We might not know about the wheel. We might not know about horses. We might not know about pottery. We might not know about many things. Indian numerals that came to the UK. We wouldn't have computers because we wouldn't have 0 and 1 on which they're based. So it's unimaginable. And I argue in the book that it is our ability to migrate and its migration that's made humanity what it is. We our success, our species, our advances, our great civilizations, everything we know and are is because of migration. It's also that physiologically we've adapted because of migration. You know, we interbred with the Neanderthals about 45,000 years ago. We interbred with the Denisovans about the same time on the Tibetan plateau in that part of the world. So Homo sapiens interbreeding is partly the reason we're so adaptable, why we have different complexions and why we're able to live at great altitudes, why we're able to live in great cold and so on. It was the migration that evolved that. It was evolved the sharing of ideas, and then once we'd peopled the world, which was about, including South America 25,000 years ago, we might get or might not get to the extraordinary things. How did people go to Australia 45,000 years ago? How did they actually get there? But we know they did. Then we started bumping into each other again, and that's what led to this acceleration of evolution, because people that had spent thousands of years developing an idea in one place suddenly passed it on to others that came and saw it. And took it back with them or went somewhere else. And the same is true, of course, of all plants. We would have none of the foods we eat. We'd have none of the range of products that we have, whether it's potatoes, rice, or anything else, without migration. It's all migration. We would have none of the flowers and plants we have in our gardens and in our forests. So that's migration that defined humanity, and I believe, and that's the argument of the book, continues to, and that we'll need it even more because the challenges we face now and the need for innovation and new ideas is greater than ever, given the complexity of 21st century issues. And so that's basically what we need. We need people to be able to swap ideas more rapidly. We can do it virtually. And that's very good. But all the evidence, and I've got a research group in Oxford that's working on this, is actually virtual connectivity is different qualitatively from physical connectivity, which there's a sideshow here about whether remote work or not is good. But you're here physically because you don't want to just watch the video of this. It's a different thing. You'll have a different experience. And that's true of innovation. And it's certainly true of problem solving. And what we know from the literature on problem solving, which goes back to why humans have been such great problem solvers from the beginning, is that the more diversity you have, the more people from different experience and different backgrounds you have in a laboratory or in a political cabinet, the more effective will be your political solutions.
I can just imagine a very long ago Nigel Farage being very worried about the Denisovans.
I mean, Nigel, just as something on Nigel Farage, which is strange. I don't think he has much Denisovan, but he has a lot of Neanderthal, perhaps. He, and his name points to this, he wouldn't exist if the UK hadn't allowed the Huguenot refugees into the UK in the 1490s when they were all killed in France and what's now the Low Countries, Netherlands.
Is this an argument for or against immigration?
Touché, yeah. It's just so rich when people like him, who are the product of refugees, and you might remember some of those iconic etchings of the Huguenots in coming to Britain, say the things they do. I mean, and it's the same. I find that with my own background, but I find it incomprehensible.
Yeah, we'll come on to having to find it comprehensible, because you actually do find it comprehensible.
Yes, we need to make it comprehensible.
In the book you try and comprehend
yes, exactly.
it. There's an interesting paradox here, which is that you've pointed out that actually 97% or thereabouts of people stay put. And so what you pointed to is the movement of the 3% is actually incredibly beneficial for the rest of us if you look on the broad sweep of history.
Yes, I mean, we wouldn't exist if some people hadn't had the courage to move. Not only you and me, but humanity. You know, where people were coming from was affected by famines, by all sorts of other things. We would have died out as a species. I think that's pretty well accepted now by paleontologists and by archaeologists and others. But that's always been the case. People have moved for a number of reasons. One has been what's over that hill, curiosity, or I don't like my in-laws, I think I'm going to move away with my family. Let's go, some desire to create a different life elsewhere. But a lot of it has been out of absolute necessity as well. And those factors have always combined.
Let's talk a bit about the kind of great migration movements in history and what we might learn from them.
I think what we learn is that, firstly, it's these very brave people that do it. What I call in a previous book, exceptional people, both because they're exceptional in the societies they go to, but also exceptional for societies they leave. There's quite a lot of evidence that they're exceptionally effective. If you look at the share of startups in the UK from immigrants are something like 15% of the UK population, 40% of small business creation and startups. If you look at Academy Award winners, if you look at Nobel Prize winners, if you look at any of these statistics, these sort of indicators of people at the frontier of creativity, science, etc., try and think of a Silicon Valley iconic firm that's not immigrant founded. So we know that they are dynamic in the societies they go to. The periods of mass migration are often propelled by conflicts, by wars, by famines, or political arbitrariness. I mean, the arbitrariness of the division of India by Cyril Ratcliffe, who had never been a barrister, had never been west of Paris, drawing a line in the sand, and the carve-up of Africa in the Berlin Conference by completely unknowing and people, real barbarism, what's being called cartographic violence. That forces a migration by law, and people, Michel Hussein's just been talking about this, people are just forced away from their family, from their communities. So terrible, terrible suffering, and certainly that's the story often of minority groups. It's the story of people who thought they were assimilated until they weren't, because suddenly they're defined as other by the society they thought that they were part of defining. And that, the quickness in which this happens, and we've seen it, I thought we hadn't seen the end of it, but we keep seeing it. We saw it in the Bosnian wars and how people started killing their neighbors. We've seen it in Rwanda more recently, and we're seeing it in other places. This ability of politicians, of the media, of the psyche to get whipped up and define people as other, and then leading to these mass expulsions. No. But we saw, I think, close to home, what the British. Why did over half the Irish population leave Ireland? And lots of books have been written about this, clearly. But it's often from conquest. And then the one big thing that's sort of which really shows that migration is not always good, and so far I've talked about it as a positive thing, but clearly it's not always, is slavery. You know, people basically being subjugated either by their own governments. It was the West African governments that subjugated slaves, as well as foreigners, but the foreigners very seldom actually went in and captured slaves. It tended to be local kings and people with subjugation powers. But 10, 11 million people forcibly moved to the Americas. About 4 million people died resisting it. 2 million people died in passage. These are barbaric examples of mass movement of people captured. And of course, slavery wasn't invented by the Europeans. It's been going on for many thousands of years. But the Europeans invented that, mass industrialization of it in the way it was done. And the Brits absolutely at the center of it. So one should never think of migration, and maybe we began by characterizing it, as I did, as mainly good. That needs to be heavily caveated by these subjugations, enforced, and a lot of the history of migration is enforced migration. I mean, the South African apartheid era, which was part of my childhood, was forced movement of people. That's what it was about. Not only within South Africa, but from neighboring countries to work on the South African mines and in industry. And the same is true in many colonial exploitations. And of course, the forced expulsion. You know, in the US, the federal government declared that Native Americans were not Americans. They'd been there for 15 to 20,000 years, and they were told that this was no longer their land, and they were forced far west, and those that didn't were killed. 600 Spaniards killed maybe 15, 20 million Native Americans in Latin America. So it's a very complex and brutal story, but that shouldn't be an excuse for keeping migrants out today that are voluntarily coming or involuntarily coming because they're in legitimate fear of their lives or persecution, which is the international law on refugees.
There is, I mean, since you pointed out, there is a kind of horrible irony in thinking about the people from Africa who died in the slave ships coming over, now, in a sense, being replaced by the people on boats going across the Mediterranean from Africa who are drowning in the Mediterranean. Yes. And there is something to be said about that, but possibly we've said it. Yeah. Let's talk a bit more now about resistance to migration. Essentially, as I said at the beginning, you and I are horribly aligned. But we have to recognise the fact that our side does not win this argument, or doesn't seem to win this argument, and that governments in most countries of the developed world, and not just the developed world, when confronted, I mean, South Africa's also had its big anti-migrant resistance as well, even under the post-apartheid government, does not see this as a great good, sees this as a continuous problem, continually promises to restrict it, and treats it in that kind of a way. Why is there this resistance, given the things that you've laid out?
Yes, and I haven't laid out sort of the economic arguments at all, which are obviously extremely significant. Not only that.
Well, why don't you begin with that, and then we'll go on to the second.
Okay, I mean, the basic economic story is obviously in the advanced economies, including the UK, labour forces are contracting, unemployment rates are low, and we're moving into societies which economists call non-tradable. Where non-tradables become more important. In other words, we're moving to societies where not so much manufacturing, but more meals, massages, medicine, care, these sorts of things, which are labor-intensive. and which you can't do remotely or import. You can't import a meal or import care for your elderly parent or a massage, etc. You need someone there to do it. And so there's a growing need in our societies for people of varying skills. And if they don't come, we have what's already happened in the UK and what's happening in the US, which is, for example, seasonal crops don't get picked. Or the cost of construction soars, or you have major shortages in your National Health Service, etc., etc., etc. Restaurants, the restaurant next to our house in Oxford, closing for a night or two a week because they can't get a chef. So we know that's the demand. We know that the arguments around migrants taking jobs are completely wrong. That the data shows that they create jobs, not only because they create small businesses and they're innovators and dynamic in a site, they raise productivity levels, but also because of their demand. They're also consuming things, they're eating food and so on. We also know that they contribute more to the public purse than they take out, particularly if you allow refugees to work, which the UK doesn't. But this is true generally, partly because you're having economically active people in your economy, and they're not there, you're not educating them, and you're not spending on their medicine when they're very young, which is a very high part of medical cost, or when they're very old, and you're typically not holding them for pensions. So the economic arguments are compelling in the short run as well as, and even more so in the long run. So why do people hate migrants so much? Why is it such a toxic topic? And why does Keir Starmer go and ask Maloney for advice on this topic? So I think the answer is to do with two broad categories of things. One is, it seems like, for as long as we have records, that foreigners have always been blamed for problems. The other. It's not taking responsibility for yourself, but projecting it onto others. And I think that there are lots of problems. People are feeling the pinch very much. There have been lots of problems that come from abroad. I think the financial crisis was the first big manifestation of this. I do not think we would have had Brexit in Britain or President Trump in the White House without the financial crisis. I've argued that. But the pandemic compounded this. The sense of danger, threat, etc. coming. And migrants have always been associated with pandemics. You know, that's where the term quarantine comes from Venice, keeping migrants isolated for 40 days. So I think that sort of almost psychological reaction is one dimension of it, which comes to the fore when people feel more anxious about the future and about forces from outside and what people bring. And obviously there are some terrible foreigners that come here and do bad things, but mostly it's UK people that do bad things in our society. And crime rates, by the way, of foreigners are lower. And this is true of the US as well, than they are of local people.
Yeah, but they eat the dogs.
Yeah, they eat the dogs.
They eat
exactly.
the cats.
Exactly. The second reason, I think, is that people are suffering. Wages have stagnated for people, housing is unaffordable, transport is crowded and takes longer and more congested, people are waiting on longer and longer lines in the national health, etc., etc. There's a real sense that there's not enough resource to go around. And that's been the legacy of the Thatcher-Reagan revolution. It's been the legacy of 4.5 million council homes being sold in the UK and none being built. It's the legacy of cutbacks and austerity. But ordinary people are feeling the pinch and they're feeling under pressure. Not so much on the jobs front, because most joblessness is low, but in their lives, in the resources they use, in the public services they try and access. And I think there's this feeling of it's overcrowded. Sort of the problem being on the supply side, we're not providing enough of this. People are interpreting it as a demand side thing. Too many people want this resource. And I think that's what's compounding this. It's it's sort of seeing migrants as the solution and saying, well, if we want to fix the NHS waiting list, if we want to invest more, we need more migrants. It's been flipped to say, actually, there are too many people in the UK. Which is what the right-wing politicians, but a lot of people feel. There's too many people, and then there's a third point, which is there's a massive conflation of migration and refugees. And I think that is being allowed to happen by the politicians and the media. They're not distinguishing between an ethically, morally, legally, very clearly defined set of people, which is refugees that are coming to the UK in legitimate fear of their lives, and increasingly by small boats, because we're cutting off all safe passage to them. We're not allowing them to come, and so like in the Mediterranean, they are risking their lives, and that's a shame, I think, on British people. And economic migrants, or students and others migrants, who are coming because we want them to come, because we think that students are good, because they generate huge number of jobs, or economic migrants because they're good. And this conflation, where people think that economic migrants are coming from the channel, they're not. These are Syrians, these are Afghanis, these are Eritreans that are coming. And something like 87% of them who come get their asylum claims recognized eventually after 2 or 3 years, sitting in a youth in some terrible hostel or ship, prison. We accept 12 to every 10,000 Brits of refugees. We are ranked 20th in Europe on refugees as a share of our population. And yet we think that we're being overwhelmed by these people. And I think it's an absolute failure of leadership of the politicians and the media not to make the distinctions, not to say we need migrants and to go out on the front foot. But you can't do it unless you at the same time invest in affordable housing, transport, etc. And because I think people do feel that there's not enough resource to go down.
However, just to put a point on that, part of the paradox of the anti-migrant movements is that they seem always to be strongest where migration is less. In other words, the places actually that are crowded are not the places that worry most about migrants.
Yes.
So
London's the classic example. I mean, London's 30% migrant.
Yeah.
And there's not much anti-migrant sentiment in London compared to places with much. Absolutely. And this is true around the world. People also perceive, you would have seen opinion polls around this, perceive that there's something like 3 times more migrants than there are. And that's because they also isolated in particular communities and very visible at times.
Okay, so final question before we open this up. What are you and I going to do about it?
Well, I mean, we have easy answers. I write books and try and convince a few people, like have kindly come to our event today. Just keep at it, keep throwing the facts out, keep trying to do that. You do it through your brilliant BBC work. That's what we can do. That's what we know how to do. But it's obviously not working, is it? So we need to do more, which is why I did the book. And we need to try, I think, and convince others through the argument. But also, I think, make some of these links. When you look at the opinion polls on where immigration stands as a topic, it's often not top. You know, people say affordability of housing, this and that, health service, whatever, and migration will be somewhere down. If you try and link them, I think one would make progress. But I think we all just need to keep up the work. I don't see, and I've actually convened a workshop in Oxford of journalists, psychoanalysts, and a whole lot of people to try and get, is there something there that we're missing that we could be doing? And it was frustrating because we all went around saying, we're doing what we can, but we're not sure what more we can really do on this. The Migration Observatory, by the way, in Oxford, for those of you that haven't looked at its website, I think it's a terrific resource. Just getting the facts out. on this.
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, whatever my own opinions, when we make this program for the BBC, they don't count for anything. So we're looking really at the people who are most genuinely expert, and the Migration Observatory are the most genuinely expert. So you go to them. There was a long period before the Migration Observatory was set up when actually a lot of journalists would go to Migration Watch for their figures, and this is a straightforwardly anti-migrant group. So it's a really big argument to try and persuade people not to do that anymore. Anyway, I think we should open it up a bit. We've got lots and lots of hands. I'm going to take the woman in the front first, please, but largely because she's in the front. Sorry, no, come on. Yeah. Well, if I don't come to her, I can see her being cross with me, whereas I can't see the rest of it.
I'm Heather Vernon. I run a comms agency called Woburn Partners, and we've done a lot of work with migration charities on Dubs Amendment, Rwanda, safe and legal routes, all kinds of things. And actually, the Migration Observatory has been a very helpful resource. My question is, we're obviously working at the kind of journalist, politician, who are all dictated by the public. We're working at that level a lot of the time. So we come across a lot of these hostile arguments, and I'm always looking for the silver bullet arguments. You've talked about some of those challenging comms problems and some of the obvious facts that are in your book. I just wanted to touch on one that we come across a lot, which is about cultural differences and the sense that multiculturalism has failed, the sense that a lot of migrants, certainly the ones that are made most high profile, are from cultures that are very different to our own, and a reasonable argument against a lot of the very common sense things that we need to do here is views on LGBT, safety of women, all of these different things. And I wonder if you have a question to both of you, really, from the policy expert and the media perspective. How do you tackle that one?
In the book, you'll have to forgive me, but this really is Ian's gig, so I'll not answer. In the book, you do make some suggestions about what it is you might ask of people who are coming into a country from outside.
Yeah. Well, I've just been distracted because I think you're wearing a Gunners t-shirt, aren't you?
There's always somebody going to spoil the vibe.
I'm drawing the right side of crowd here. Very good. Sorry about that. I know you're a Tottenham supporter. Sorry.
I mean, just ruin the entire event.
See, we take all sorts of cultural differences. I think it's an extremely important point, and what I propose in the book is basically a migration bargain, which is we accept people, we treat them fairly, we make sure that they get minimum wages, health and safety, and all the other things that citizens would get, but we expect of them. It's a rights and responsibilities argument. We expect of them that they are documented, and this, by the way, raises a very interesting sideshow about documentation, which obviously is a touch point in the UK. That they pay their taxes and that they abide by all our laws. It's sort of an open question as to how one interprets that. But respect for the rule of law of a society that's democratically elected. Now, how many of you have ever taken the UK nationality test? Okay. It is quite bizarre. How many people live in Wales? 3.1, 3.2, 3.3 million. That's one of the questions in the nationality test. Okay, I'm not sure many of you would qualify.
I've always imagined what would happen if everybody had to take that test now and were thrown out of the country if they couldn't get it right.
Well, we should get Nigel Farage to take it. So I think one has to be very careful about what one thinks of as being what makes you British, what makes you... I think many of us... One of the reasons, incidentally, that you have less anti-immigrant sentiment in very culturally and diverse places like London is that people thrive on the multiculturalism. It is extremely multicultural. If we only had to eat British, what used to be British pub food is no longer, because now you'll get your curry at your pub. But it's what makes the place dynamic in every respect. So I think we should be very strong on rights and responsibilities as the answer to that, and we should respect people's cultural diversities, their religions, their gender identities, and everything else. But I don't think, and there's an interesting discussion in the migration community about assimilation versus diversity, and to what extent do you, for example, force people to learn your language. And I think if you're coming to England, you're going to go to English school, you're going to learn English. But some places don't insist on that. You can learn in your own language. So I think that's a live debate, but I think within the as long as you abide by the law. So I don't think we should allow polygamy in the UK. And I think people that are polygamous should face the law, that it's not allowed, for example. It's not their cultural choice. But if they want to do other things, that's legal, that's fine.
Yes, gentleman there, please.
My name is Max Wolke. I live in Germany, and maybe wanted to provide that perspective because there's been a resurgent right in Germany. But this is also a country that's accepted 1.1 million Ukrainians, 1 million Syrians. The FPÖ in Austria, Herbert Kickl, who's a real Nazi, has just been elected. And I've had the privilege, I guess, of going through Germany to some of the regions like Thüringen, where the AfD were voted, and speaking to people outside of our little metropolitan elite bubble, as we often characterised here, and listening to their concerns. And I want to come back to the crowding out argument that Ian made before, because there's a real concern that with that level of inward migration, schools, hospitals, healthcare, indigenous, and I hate that word, but that term is used, people are being put to the back of the queue. And that feels like a legitimate concern. And I feel the left or the liberal side of the argument doesn't cut through to these people, and they feel patronised, and they get more angry, and they get more polarised. And when you're sat with them in a bar, you get a different perspective. So I wanted to answer that.
Yeah.
Well, can I just qualify, ask, what question are you asking to be answered? Because the problem is that the perception is actually not true. And it's not true in Thuringia. We kind of know this. So what you're actually asking is, how do we change the wrong perceptions that people have?
Correct it, yeah.
Okay.
That's exactly the question.
Well, I think there is some truth in the perception. I think people are feeling that the housing is unaffordable, that they're not getting what they want, and I think they are sometimes feeling like their kids are going to school and now and their language, whether it's German, is sort of a minority language in the school, and so I think we need to empathize. These are not deplorables, We need to empathize with people that feel anxieties, and try and get inside their heads and their lives and understand why do they feel this, in order to address the concerns. Sometimes they're just pure bigots, and but most of the time there's real stuff going on that's made their life very difficult, and unless we address those real things. So one of the things I would argue as part of the migration bargain that I recommend in the book is that we need to invest in the places that have high immigrant communities. This is very hot, by the way, in Toronto at the moment, for example, which is 48% immigrant, and where you're suddenly seeing, after generations of welcoming of immigrants, an anti-immigration backlash. And the answer is because suddenly locals are finding themselves completely outpriced of the housing market, amongst other things. And so I think the answer is not keep out the immigrants, the answer is invest in housing, etc.
You're right, Paul, but the problem is, in the parts of Austria which were electing the far-right party, and in the parts of Germany that are electing the AfD, those are not their problems. And they're actually, no, they aren't. The problem of the left behind places is literally that their youth are leaving.
Yeah.
And that's as far as I can tell, what creates this. And this is one thing we haven't touched upon, which is we are very blithe, you and I, about immigration.
Yes.
What's our feeling about emigration? And I won't forget that you've had your hand up there in a moment. Just very briefly, and we'll come to that last question.
On two things, David, because I should have mentioned this as well. This left behind place, and that was the topic of my previous book, Age of the City, is turbocharged now by moving to a knowledge economy and AI and everything else. And basically the things that anchored old economies, which was manufacturing industry and place, proximity to a natural resource, the Industrial Revolution shaped the economic pattern of the UK and where cities are. as it did in France, as it did in Germany, as it did in the US, etc. And now, none of that is relevant. And these places are genuinely left behind. There are no jobs there. And you cannot afford to go, because I also did a BBC series on this, you cannot afford to go to the new places, or you can't get your kids into school, your parents into an elderly care, or whatever. And you can't afford to commute there because there's no public transport, and it takes too long. So dealing with left behind places and the mobility of people are half as mobile today in the US between cities, or in Europe between cities, people from the north of England to London than they were 50 years ago. Because of this rigidity of place. And dealing with that is incredibly important. Some of the solutions are similar to the solutions of mine, but I agree with you, it's a different issue. One of the reasons, of course, that the dynamic places are doing so well is because they have such a high share of immigrants. There's a very close correlation between share of immigrants. There's also, incidentally, a very close correlation between what share of immigrants are, and this goes back to the point on cultural diversity, and how happy people are to live in. So if you look at the Economist index of the best cities in the world to live in, for example, and then you put up a table of the cities with the highest immigrant share, they're virtually matched.
Yeah.
You know, Vancouver, Toronto, Melbourne, London, etc.
We've got time for one more question, and it's to that gentleman. I'm sorry, but he had his hand up first. I do beg your pardon.
You read a lot about climate change and the potential tipping point that's coming. We're also living in a multipolar world where conflicts are more, or at least we perceive them to be more and increasing. So the pressure on populations to move, we can kind of intuit that might be the future. What's your perspective on the next 20 or 30 years of migratory pressures?
Yeah.
Great place to end.
I think the principal pressures in the future, as they have been in the past, will be two things. One is unlivable places because of conflict or famine or war, and livelihoods. So basically people being impoverished. There's a very big open question about the future of Africa as jobs, because the middle rungs of the development ladder by which Asia and every place, the UK, every place is always developed, is repetitive rules-based jobs. And that's increasingly going to be done by machines. And so the big question is, where are the 100 million people coming onto the labor force over the 10 years in Africa, next 10 years in Africa, going to get jobs or livelihoods from, and future years? So big question. I don't think they'll come to Europe, because I think they'll go to a few dynamic economies in Africa, 97% of them, but some will come here. The conflicts seem to be getting worse. God knows what's going to happen in Ukraine if Trump gets elected, and then other places possibly in Europe. Obviously Gaza, Afghanistan's getting worse, and the Horn is getting worse in Sudan. But 90% of refugees go to neighboring countries. They just cannot get here, faraway places. And the UK is particularly isolated because it's an island and of long distance. So Italy, Greece are particularly the entry points. And this goes back to the question of refugees and burden sharing amongst refugees, which I think is absolutely essential and that our politicians should show leadership on. Climate refugees is a big unknown. Guy Evans has written this book where he talks about up to 1 billion climate refugees in the next 50 years or so. I think this is alarmist. I think we need to be incredibly careful about weaponizing migration and saying, if you don't do this, these people are going to come here.
Yeah.
That's part of the reason, by the way, that people see them as a threat, is we're saying they're a threat. If we don't do this, they're going to come here. If we don't give aid to Africa, the Africans will come here. If we don't, reduce climate change, we're going to have the world's population landing on our shores. The weaponization of it is dangerous, and also not true. They won't come here. They'll go to their neighboring countries or they'll go somewhere else. That's not the reason. In fact, there's a migration hump. There's some evidence that the more aid you give them, more people you enable people to migrate. So we need to be very, very careful in these numbers on climate refugees, I think. And I think that book, because it's a compounding factor. There are many things going on in people's lives which mean they can't survive, but we know you can survive in the desert. You know, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, Phoenix, Las Vegas are amongst the most dynamic, rapidly growing cities in the world, and they're desert cities. There's nothing there, no water and just heat. You live in an air-conditioned cocoon, drilling water from deeper and piping it from further or desalinating it. So you have enough money, you're not a climate refugee, but it's the poor people of the world who will starve and other things. So it's not, the World Bank's estimated between 100 million and 300 million, I think, climate refugees. There obviously are some places that will just disappear. We're projecting in Oxford that oceans will rise by 2 to 5 meters this century. Okay. Mumbai, Shanghai, Jakarta, Miami, and you could go on, underwater. And these are dynamic cities. A big question, where do those people go, and what happens to the economies that they're driving? But I think we will see much more migratory pressure, but let me make another projection, which is I think in 30 or 40 years' time, we're going to be having the opposite conversation in this room. Hopefully this room will still be here, which is how do we attract more people to the UK? Yeah. The fertility and demographic drivers are so predictable and so stark that this argument in Europe, and also in some places which aren't having the argument now, like China, will be turned on its head.
Ian, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for those brilliant questions. Thank you to Ian, who will be signing his books now. We've got to get out of here.
But no, don't get out. Come and sign a book and chat to me.
So come sign a book.
You've got to get out of here.
I got to get out.
He's got to go to a Tottenham game, so good luck to you.
Thanks very much.